super flyweight division, 115 pounds, was first instituted in 1980. Funny enough, the same year as when the cruiserweight division was first instituted, albeit cruiserweight was 190 before it was 200. But 115 pounds was first instituted in 1980 by the WBC, with their inaugural champion being Rafael Orono of Venezuela. The WBA followed suit later in the next year, in 81, with Gustavo Bayas becoming their first champion. The IBF then followed suit in 1983, with Ju Do Chun of South Korea becoming their first champion, and the WBO finally instituted their title in 1989, with Jose Ruiz of Puerto Rico becoming their first champion. Being that this is one of the younger divisions in the sport, and being that it's basically the second youngest division of the flyweight divisions, outside of 105 pounds, there hasn't been a tremendous number of world champions of all-time great level fighters, especially by virtue of the fact that a lot of the great fighters that fought at 115 pounds actually kind of used it as a pass-through division. A lot of guys would start out at 108 or 112, they'd pass through 115 and go on to 118. Or sometimes they'd start at 115 and they'd fairly quickly move up to 118, 122, and so on. For big money, bigger purses, bigger fights, and all that stuff. But the one guy that was probably the original torchbearer of this division, and probably still the torchbearer to a certain degree, by virtue of the fact that he set the record of 19 world title defenses, was Khaosai Galaxy. Khaosai Galaxy was a bad man, a guy, a power punching southpaw, who stylistically I'd probably compare to a little bit of like the older version of George Foreman, where he'd be kind of flat-footed, straight up, and he would just kind of paw out with his jab and look to set up the big left hand. He was a southpaw, big left hands, and won most of his fights by knockout. Frankly, he retired at 47-1 with 41 knockouts. Now that one loss only came, I believe it was like his fifth or his sixth fight in his career, but after that it was pretty much he just rolled over everybody that he fought. Knocked out Eusebio Espinal for the initial title that he won, the WBA Super Flyweight title, and defended it a number of times, 19 times total, before finally retiring in 1991. So he basically reigned for almost 7 years actually more than 7 years, little more than 7 years as the Super Flyweight champion. Outside of Khaosai Galaxy, a number of other great fighters have fought in this division. Let me try and go in chronological order here. There was another notable name is Gilberto Roman of Mexico, who was one of Nacho Berisstein's original pupils, like one of his first like truly great fighters. A guy, a slick mover. He pretty much was the originator of the Beristain style, where it's more of a counter punching style as opposed to what people traditionally think of Mexican fighters for, like the Julio Cesar Chavez style, for instance. And it's kind of funny because he actually came up around the same time as Chavez, late 80s. Reigned as a champion on 2 different occasions. As well as him, there was also other great champions such as Nana Konadu. Let's see. Jesus Kiki Rojas, Hideki Todaka, Rafael Orono, I already mentioned. And towards the early to mid 90s is where there started to be a bit of a rivalry at this weight class between 2 guys from the same city, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Johnny Tapia, the late great Johnny Tapia, and Daniel Romero. 2 fighters who both became champions around the same time. Johnny Tapia initially was on his way to winning a title in 1990 when he became the USBA Super Flyweight champion, but he wound up testing positive for cocaine and was suspended for 3.5 years. But pretty quickly after he came back from his suspension and going to jail and all that, he won a world title at Super Flyweight within, I think, like 8 months of coming back, and defended his title about 10 or 11 times before he eventually met Danny Romero, who Romero had been a flyweight champion, 112-pound champion, moved up to Super Flyweight after a couple defenses, won a title there, and it became a huge rivalry between these 2 fighters, these 2 undefeated fighters going head to head against each other. Both guys from the same town, both guys trained in the same gym as kids. Um, Tapia, however, was the more experienced fighter of the two, the guy that was more relaxed in the ring. Danny Romero had more of like a peekaboo type style, a very intense, in your face, power punching style. Johnny Tapia was a bit more fluid, a bit more outside, a bit more James Toney esque, where he would shoot the jab from long distance and kind of and roll with punches and try to counter you as you threw punches at him, rolling in and out of a defensive kind of a shoulder roll stance with big power shots. Johnny Tapia won that fight, and that kind of spelled the end of Danny Romero's prime, as he would go on to move up to super bantamweight and bantamweight and lose title shots there. But Johnny Tapia reigned for a number of years after that. And outside of Khaosai Galaxy, pretty much became probably the most notorious and most notable fighter that became a world champion at super flyweight. Several other good fighters at super flyweight won world titles, however. Jerry Peñalosa of the Philippines, who later, of course, also became a world champion at bantamweight several years later, making a big comeback with a knockout win over Johnny Gonzalez, as well as Masamori Tokuyama from North Korea. And you heard that right, from North Korea. He's a fighter who was actually, if I remember right, I believe he was born in Japan, but his parents were from North Korea, so he was actually a North Korean citizen. Because of the fact that he was from North Korea, however, that he had his citizenship in North Korea, dual citizenship, North Korea and Japan, he was not allowed in either South Korea or the United States. So he basically couldn't fight outside of Japan. He wound up having a big rivalry with Katsushige Kawashima, who was a native Japanese fighter, and Tokuyama was a bit of a bad guy in Japan, because he would wear the one Korea, the logo One Korea on his trunks, which represented the ideals of there is no North and South Korea, there's one Korea, and South Korea is basically like a bunch of infidels, for lack of a better term, a bunch of like traitors, basically traitors of the state, enemies of the state. So Tokuyama caught a lot of flack for things like that. It's kind of funny. Eventually, after he retired, he wound up renouncing his North Korean citizenship and became a South Korean citizen. But while he was a world champion, he was definitely a signal of controversy over in Japan and in the Koreas. Other great fighters also included a great rivalry, three-way rivalry actually, between Martin Castillo of Mexico, Nobuo Nashiro of Japan, and Alexander Munoz of Venezuela. These three guys pretty much traded fights back and forth with each other in a little bit of a triangle rivalry. It's kind of similar to Pacquiao, Morales, and Barrera. Pretty much, guys, they kind of went back and forth. This guy beat that guy, then that guy beat this guy, but this guy lost to the first guy that won against the second guy. They engaged in some great fights, and Martin Castillo actually has a very, very notable couple of wins in the amateurs over one Floyd Money Mayweather. Martin Castillo, I think it was twice that he beat Mayweather in the amateurs. I don't know if it was three times. I believe it was twice, if I remember correctly. But every time he fought him, apparently he had defeated him. So that was a feather in his cap before he ever turned pro. And then, of course, as a pro, he became one of the all-time great super flyweight champions, in spite of the loss to Nashiro. Also, other champions that passed through the division include Vic Darchinyan, who, after getting knocked out by Nonito Donaire, went on to fight tougher opponents, better opponents than Donaire did, and win a title at super flyweight, becoming a pretty vicious name. Around this same time, also, Jorge Arce was becoming a big name outside of Mexico and the United States and such, and he wound up moving up out of flyweight. He was a light flyweight world champion initially, became a flyweight champion, moved up to super flyweight to fight for a vacant belt against Cristian Mijares, and got schooled by Cristian Mijares. Mijares was pretty much on his way to marching up the pound for pound rankings until he met Vic Darchinyan in a well, actually, was it Unification? No, actually, you know what? I think that was Darchinyan's initial title shot when he fought Mijares, because Mijares had beat Arce for the one title. He then beat Alexander Munoz to unify titles, then fought Vic Darchinyan and wound up getting knocked out, and that was pretty much the end of Mijares' prime. Mijares just wasn't the same after that fight. Vic Darchinyan, of course, reigned for a little while. Eventually left the division for bantamweight and super bantamweight, and vacating his titles. And then another great fighter that passed through here, or a couple of great fighters actually, were Mark Two Sharp Johnson. Of course, a guy who started his career at flyweight. He was a flyweight world champion and the super flyweight world champion. And Fernando Montiel. Now, Fernando Montiel in his initial title shot at super flyweight actually dropped the decision against Mark Two Sharp Johnson. Mark Two Sharp Johnson eventually lost his super flyweight title to Ivan Hernandez, and then Hernandez eventually got knocked out about a year after beating Too Sharp by Fernando Montiel. Montiel beat Ivan Hernandez, so that became another little bit of a triangle rivalry between those three. Of course, Montiel eventually moved out of the super flyweight division in order to win titles at bantamweight and above. One of his most notable wins being over Hozumi Hasegawa at bantamweight. And then, in addition to them, that pretty much leads up more towards the current day. Several fighters have come across here, including Kohei Kono, reigned, lost, and then is now a reigning champion again. He's the WBA champion. The current WBO champion is Naoya Inoue after having dethroned Omar Narvaez, who was another all-time great fighter at this weight. Omar Narvaez reigned for it was about 4.5 years before Naoya Inoue moved up and just destroyed him in 2 rounds. Just did what you very rarely see a guy moving up in weight do. A guy jumped over 2 weight classes, jumped from 108 over 112 all the way to 115, and destroyed Narvaez in 2 rounds, making Inoue the current WBO champion and pretty much the current #1 fighter of the division. You have Carlos Cuadras, who is the WBC champion after having dethroned Sisaket Sorongvisai, who was a 2-time champion at this weight. And then you finally have McJoe Arroyo of the IBF. Although Arroyo's status may be in jeopardy because of a recent issue with not finding his mandatory, and if he had a valid medical excuse for it due to a hand injury. The previous champion actually was Zlani Tete, a guy who made himself very well known for knocking out Paul Butler, but he's since left the division for bantamweight, so we'll see how he does up there. So basically, this is a division that's largely been a pass-through division by and large by a lot of fighters. The main guys that kind of stayed around and reigned for a good little while at this division were mainly the guys that I mentioned, Khaosai Galaxy. You had Gilberto Roman. You had Johnny Tapia. You have Masamori Tokuyama. You have Fernando Montiel and Mark Two Sharp Johnson. Those are pretty much the major names that reigned in the division for a good little while, and are pretty much the all-time greats of the division. Now, of course, now this division is probably going to start heating up again, because now with Inoue and Cuadras, that's 2 undefeated world champions at the top, as well as the fact that Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez may be moving up into the division, the current pound-for-pound #1, which will immediately make a big marker on the division, big change in the division insofar as money goes, as well as Juan Francisco Estrada is likely to move up in his next fight. He's already announced that he wants to fight Luis Concepcion, who's the interim WBA champion, if he's not able to get an immediate rematch with Roman Gonzalez, should Gonzalez get past Mick Williams Arroyo. So this is a division, a fairly new division, but a division with a fair amount of history in itself. Great fights to watch on here. In this division is any fight from Khaosai Galaxy. The guy was an action fighter from beginning to end in every single fight, and usually knocked his opponent clean out. Several of Gilberto Roman's fights, especially the one against Sugar Baby Rojas, as well as his fight against Nana Konadu, great fights. Also the fights between Martin Castillo, Alexander Munoz, and Nobuo Nashiro, great fights, all of those. The fight between Cristian Mijares and Alexander Munoz, another great fight to check out. And then Naoya Inoue is, his recent fights have been very, very explosive. The Mark Two Sharp Johnson versus Fernando Montiel fight is a very, very good tactical fight to watch. But that's pretty much all for the Super Flyweight division, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Peace.